En el centro de la pampa vive un pimiento. Sol y viento pa' su vida, sol y viento. Sol y viento.
Hello, my name is Patrick Barnard. Welcome to the 49th edition of the Pimento Report. It is Wednesday, May 16th, 2012, and we are going to carry a special report tonight about the Quebec student strike, which is now entering its 14th week. It is a strike against the introduction of higher tuition fees for university here in this province. Today, the very well-known commentator Chantal Hébert said that Quebec now is probably going through a leadership crisis greater than at any time in living memory. This student strike is a social movement of enormous importance. Today we're going to listen to interviews that the Pimento Report has done with 4 graduate students who have supported this strike from the beginning. They give an unusual perspective. They are parents, 3 of them. They have a knowledge of Quebec and of places outside in North America and in Europe. So let's listen to these 4 people who may tell us a lot about the deep and inner meaning of this student strike. What is your name, please, and what do you study?
Okay, my name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I'm studying sociology at the master's level at Concordia.
Sarah, what's your view of the strike now? We're in work week 13. What do you think is happening here?
I think we've reached a bit of an impasse. The government has made an offer that the students have rejected, and violence is escalating, and pressures on both the governments and the students to come to some agreement. And both sides seem to have an increasing level of antagonism, and there's also an increased level of police force and pressure tactics from the police.
Now, you've supported the strike from the beginning. What is your view of the strike? Why do you support it?
Essentially, I support the strike because there is an increased amount of neoliberalization taking place. The universities are increasingly funded through private enterprises, and they're funded for the purpose of increasing profit in the private sector. So research monies are going towards very specific departments and very specific endeavors within the university system. And instead of the government taking over more responsibility for more equitable distribution of funds for research, they are allowing the private sector to take over essentially the management of higher education.
You have a child, a young son. You are bringing him up. You are going to university. Do you think that gives you a rather special view of this?
To return to your previous question, I do actually think that this is exactly why I'm participating in this strike, whereas I will not benefit from any action taken by the government to maintain or decrease tuition costs. My hope is that my son will benefit from any action we're taking today.
You have supported the strike here from the beginning, is that right?
That's right. I began mobilizing about a year ago, a bit over a year ago, with a group called Free Education Montreal, based at Concordia. And so since then, we've held different sort of events at Concordia to raise awareness about governance issues, and then sort of leading into tuition issues.
So that group you mentioned is one of the many groups that is part of this movement. What is the position of your group about the tuition rises and tuition generally?
Well, there's pretty much an agreement that tuition hikes are unacceptable, but there's also a sort of feeling that the direction that our society should be moving in is towards free education. That as societies become wealthier, that wealth should manifest itself as greater degree of public good, of shared wealth, as opposed to a higher concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people.
Is this protest movement in Quebec then not only a reaction to wealth, but in some sense a product of an affluent society?
I think it is. I think it's an interpretation of the sort of changes that we've been seeing internationally. This comes with a certain context, an international context, and especially following the 2008 financial crisis. We have a sort of perspective on the concentration of wealth in society, the way that societies sort of distribute their wealth, and the sort of injustice involved in that distribution, especially as we begin talking about things like debt, public debt. This sort of becomes a way for governments to privatize, to carry out programs of large-scale privatization, which are hugely problematic for most levels of society.
There are any number of existing, theorists who are working on what it means to have accessible education, and there are schools of thought who sort of examine education initially as a privilege for a privileged class, moving through the first part of the 20th century where it was a sort of a right of the people. The end of the 20th century, it becomes an obligation, and so students are in some ways in a double bind in which they're obligated, or many people are obligated to study, and yet the subjects in which they study are not necessarily valorized socially according to this neoliberal agenda. And they're expected, I say a double bind, because they're expected to pay, and in some cases enter into what's effectively an indentured servitude. If you look at the issue of the debt crisis, the student debt crisis in the United States, which is really exploding right now.
Walter, you know Vermont well, you know the United States well. How much has your American experience shaped your sense of what is going on here in Quebec?
If I was living in the States, I was considering the very onerous burden of more than $100,000 probably of student loans in debt there. It's not something that I would have been able to realize for myself.
You're talking about somewhat older students, often with families that they're bringing up, and whose lives are very much connected with public policy.
Right. And I think it's important to recognize that tuition is just one kind of drop in the bucket of the cost to attend post-secondary institutions. For instance, I carry $20,000 in debt, and this is primarily through just cost of living loans needed to pay for basic living expenses. Tuition is a small portion of that, but it's important to realize that there are a number of different facets to this strike and this protest movement, that people are paying for education, but they're also paying for other things. So it's not just tuition that's the issue. It's the issue of how much it actually costs to attend university.
Je pense que la raison superficielle, c'est l'augmentation des frais de scolarité. Si je dis raison superficielle, c'est que la grande majorité des étudiants qui font la grève seraient capables de payer une augmentation sur leurs frais. Le problème, c'est qu'ils ressentent une très grande injustice de payer ces frais-là, alors que le gouvernement empochent personnellement des milliers de dollars dans les scandales que ce soit le scandale de la construction, que ce soit les redevances minières, que ce soit beaucoup de choses. Et les étudiants sont très au courant de ça. Donc, il y a vraiment un grand sentiment d'injustice, premièrement par rapport au gouvernement Charest, mais généralement par rapport au monde entier, où on voit que notre génération, on va devoir prendre notre retraite plus tard, on paye déjà des impôts très élevés, on paye déjà des taxes très élevées, il va falloir payer des frais de scolarité très élevés, et en plus de tout ça, on va avoir une planète qui va être complètement détruite.
Une loi spéciale pour tenter de mettre un terme au conflit étudiant au Québec.
Il est temps que le calme revienne.
It is just after 10 p.m., May 16th, 2012. The Premier of Quebec, Monsieur Jean Charest, has just appeared on television. He and his cabinet have decided to bring down special legislation. They're going to move the whole school year forward into the autumn, and then they're also going to have other legislation to deal with, apparently, various types of demonstrations. These student leaders have also been on television expressing extreme disappointment, saying that they will actually politically campaign against Monsieur Charest, and that in fact an enormous gap has opened up between the generations in Quebec.
Vient mettre ce soir un fossé important entre lui et la jeunesse du Québec.
Je pense que la frustration, elle est très, très présente. Et même si, par exemple, je dis comme ça, par exemple, le gouvernement Charest vote une loi spéciale demain pour faire retourner les gens en classe, il va probablement y avoir une accalmie de quelques jours, quelques semaines. Mais la frustration est toujours là. En plus, la fracture sociale que ça a créée est toujours là. Que les gens aient acheté la rhétorique du gouvernement en disant « Oui, c'est vrai, on paye nos impôts, qu'est-ce que vous faites, enfants gâtés ?» Ces gens-là, je dirais ces gens-là et les étudiants, il y a vraiment une fracture qui s'est créée au Québec qui fait qu'elle est encore là. Et c'est quelque chose qui est extrêmement important et qui va changer le Québec. Si on pense que demain les choses vont revenir comme avant, c'est pas vrai. Il va y avoir des mouvements sociaux qui vont se créer, il va y avoir des choses qui vont changer.